Okay, welcome everyone to today's research seminar. Gustav is away traveling, so I will be your host or chair today. And today's speaker is Christian Barry, who's a visitor here for a while and also a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. And Christian got his PhD at Columbia University in 2005 and has co-authored and authored a number of books, including International Trade and Labor Standards, a proposal for linkage, which came out in 2008, and Responding to Global Poverty, Harm, Responsibility and Agency, which came out 2016. And that's it in terms of presentations or introduction. So the stage is yours, Christian.
Thanks. So this is actually my last week at the Institute, and I wanted to, thank the Institute for hosting me. It's been a fantastic visit. It's really just been an ideal place to try to think through some of the issues that I'm talking about today, not least because really two of the only moral philosophers who have thought about this issue at all happen to be based here, which I only discovered after I got here, which was nice. And also because I just think it's kind of a really wonderful academic community. There are lots of good researchers sprinkled around the world, but there are very few places which are sort of more than the sum of their parts, and the Institute is absolutely one of those places. So it's really been a fantastic visit, and thanks everybody for making it such. So the paper I'm giving today, I should note, is joint work, or it's based on joint work with Garrett Cullity, who's a colleague at ANU, who's hopefully also joining us on Zoom. But any infelicities in the presentation are due to me and not to Garrett, although perhaps he'll join in the discussion to get me out of trouble later. Thanks. So the primary issues associated with anthropogenic climate change are issues of harm done to human beings, to non-human animals, and to the environment. Now, the mediation of our emitting and harms that result as a result of increased concentration of greenhouse gases is very complex. So it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to make causal attributions of particular harms that occur in the future to particular emissions. But nevertheless, the association with increasing GHG concentrations and harmful effects of climate change means that whenever we emit, it carries some increased expectation of harm. Now, the impetus behind net zero targets, and I'm going to be discussing the issue of ownership of emissions in the context of the evolving discourse on net zero targets, is the idea that to limit climate change risks, we need to reduce global net GHG reductions to zero, such that for any particular actor who's committing to net zero, the amount of reductions has to match the amount of emissions, their amount of emissions. Now, at the national level, and of course net zero targets are adopted by many different actors, but I'm going to be focusing specifically on net zero targets at the national level, which is where a country pledges to balance its emissions by an equivalent amount of reductions by a particular date. Now, there are lots of issues that you can raise about sort of the ethics of net zero targets, for example, whether or not net zero is even an appropriate goal. Certainly some countries, we might think, have obligations to be much more than net zero, to be net negative, and we think that many other countries may not be appropriately held to account for not achieving net zero. There's questions about what target date are appropriate for different actors, even if we do think that all actors should converge on net zero. But I'm not going to be focusing really on them today. I'm going to be focusing on specifically on the issue of what counts on the ledger, namely what emissions are allocated to a particular country such that they count as a net contribution that that country is making, and what counts on the debit side of the ledger, an offset or something like that. Okay, so, and I'm going to be sort of taking seriously this idea of net zero as it's evolved. So there are interesting questions about whether or not we should be even thinking about climate change responsibilities in terms of net zero. But what I'm engaging in today is sort of more imminent critique. Given that we have this discourse with us, how should it be most appropriately conceived for it to play the role that it's starting to play? Okay, so a net zero emissions ledger measures a country's net contribution to anthropocentric global warming via increasing GHG concentrations. What does this mean? Well, I think that the idea of what goes on the ledger as an emission is connected to this idea of contribution. So you can distinguish between greenhouse gases that a country contributes and those that it merely fails to prevent. So, for example, suppose a country can but does not provide the means for cleaner energy generation to another country, and that country subsequently increases the amount of greenhouse gases. Now, of course, the country which neglects to sell it this more energy efficient fuel may be morally accountable for what it fails to do, but nevertheless, the emissions of that country don't go on its ledger. That is, the country that simply fails to make an addition doesn't get the emission added to their ledger. So with an analogy, which I'm going to be sort of referring to throughout, we're imagine that there's sort of a boats that like to go out on the lake, and anytime they go out on the lake, there's a small amount of toxic discharge that goes into the lake. The basic idea of sort of, if you were going to be sort of zeroing out your ledger as a boater, would mean that you'd have to ensure that you extract the equivalent amount of toxins that you put in. So again, to illustrate this distinction between contributing and failing to prevent, if Ned goes boating and he emits, that counts on, he releases a certain amount of toxin into the lake, that goes on his positive ledger. Now suppose I could but don't provide Ned with an extractor. Well, I may be responsible and even culpable for not doing so, but the toxin doesn't sort of go on my ledger. That's sort of intuitively, I think, at play in the net zero idea. So the basic net zero idea seems to me that a country has organized, at least at the national level, is that a country has organized its economy in a way that makes no net addition to greenhouse gas concentration. And again, there are other ways that a country might undermine the goal of addressing climate change. So we could imagine a country which is net zero in the sense that they don't make any net additions to greenhouse gas concentrations, but act irresponsibly in other ways. So perhaps they get in and they scuttle climate negotiations, or they engage in aggressive wars. Now that country, it seems plausibly, could claim to be net zero, but of course it doesn't follow from that they're sort of a good climate actor. So I take it that whether an agent is net zero is something less, is supposed to measure something less than that they are acting responsibly in all respects with respect to climate change. It's supposed to be focusing more narrowly on whether or not the basic structure of their economy is such that they can claim to be climate neutral. Okay, so given that, there are two questions that we need to ask. One is, what emissions do we add to our ledger, and which emissions reductions subtract from our ledger? Now, previously, Garrett and I have discussed the second question about how to conceive of offsets and what kinds of offsets can legitimately be used as a way of ensuring that by emitting, we're not imposing risk. But today, we're going to be focusing on one, namely, which emissions add to our ledger. Now, there are a few different proposals in the literature. One is production-based, which is in a way a misnomer, at least at the level of countries, because it's not as if necessarily countries as such are producing. But the basic idea is that the amount of stuff that gets emitted into the atmosphere from a certain territorial jurisdiction counts as the emissions of that country. And I should note that usually when net zero targets are set internationally and in the UN framework, it is these production-based emissions that are counted. So almost all of the net zero targets are framed explicitly with respect to these production-based accounting method. Others have suggested alternatives, for example, based on consumption, where the idea is that what you would be allocating to a different country is the amount of sort of carbon and other gases that are sort of embedded in the products that are consumed. And there are other alternatives, which is based on extraction. So the idea would be that it's not necessarily where fossil fuels are burned and carbon is released into the atmosphere, but where they're extracted. So the idea would be that you would be what the emissions that would go on your ledger would not be from what is actually burned in your territory or consumed in your territory, but what is sort of embedded in the natural resources that you're extracting. And then finally, Ole has been developing an interesting alternative method. The idea is based on inducement, whereby an emission is allocated to a country if it can be said to have induced that emission. So it's pretty clear that these different ways of conceiving of inventories of emissions will come up with rather different calculations, right? Some countries are net importers of emissions, some are net exporters of emissions. And there are broad characteristics of countries which tend to be net importers of emissions. So increasingly, countries in Europe are net importers rather than exporters of emissions. And they tend to have more embedded emissions in what they consume than emissions that they actually produce. Some, but not all, European countries are also significant extractors in the relevant sense, Norway being case in point. So you can imagine that according to these different accounting methods also, if any one of them was used, it would make it correspondingly easier or more difficult for different actors, depending on how they were situated, to become net zero. So there are some distributional consequences in terms of the capacity of different countries to achieve these targets, depending on the choice of methods used. Okay, so there are two different contexts to think about this accounting issue. One is in the context of sort of a global cap and trade system or a system with a well-functioning carbon price. And the second is in the context without any such carbon price or cap and trade system. And I think that it's pretty clear that these contexts are quite different in terms of what hinges on this allocation question. So in the first scenario, namely where we have sort of a cap and trade system, not much would necessarily hinge on the choice of accounting method. For one thing, it's not clear that the kinds of complaints based on exposure to risk through increased greenhouse gas concentrations would apply, namely because by stipulation, a well-functioning cap and trade system would be one that would ensure that emissions were kept to an acceptable level, such that any risk remaining sort of caused by these emissions was sort of deemed collectively acceptable. And secondly, in such a system, the costs of upholding the terms of the scheme would be spread throughout the value chain. So imagine you had a cap and trade system in which you had to buy permits to produce emissions. If in such a system, if you bought those permits, then that would then be reflected in prices, reflected in the costs that would be faced by consumers, would be reflected in the markets that extractors would confront, and so the cost would be sort of broadly distributed through the value chain. So again, sort of going to my boating analogy, imagine you had this system where people liked to boat on the lake, but you had a cap and trade system such that, let's imagine there's a mechanism by which you can sort of run an extractor such that a certain amount of toxins are taken out of the lake. And so the idea would be that if the boater bought a permit, they would be able to go boating, and through the cost of that permit, it would underwrite the running of the extractor. And it would seem that, in that sort of case, imagine that there might be other people who consume things that result from these boat rides that would be reflected in prices faced by the consumers. And imagine if there's somebody who sells fuel to the boater, then that would also sort of the willingness of the boaters to purchase fuel and purchase them at certain prices would reflect this type of the cost of the permit. And again, even if we said that the permits had to be bought not by boaters, but by people who wish to sell fuel to boaters, the same would be true, right? And this system would ensure that so long as the extractor was running, that there wouldn't be complaints about unacceptable levels of toxicity in the lake that could be geared towards the boaters or towards the providers of resources to the boaters or to the customers of the boaters. So if that's true, then in that sort of scenario, we might, in choosing this question of how to allocate emissions, just appeal to rather straightforward criteria. One is completeness, make sure that everything gets counted. Second, accuracy, that you sort of have an accurate account of how many emissions are going to the atmosphere. Transparency and comparability, and low cost of administration. Right, so there are these different ways of counting emissions are different in various respects, not least in terms of how easy it is to compute. So, for example, it seems to be easiest to measure extraction, right? So if you have a certain amount of, partly because where carbon is sort of pulled out of the earth, there are relatively few sites where it is compared to how many places where carbon embedded in products is consumed. And it's relatively easy to sort of measure the expectation of the release of carbon into the atmosphere from a certain amount of resources that is extracted. So arguably, in that case, an extraction-based scheme might be best because the administration costs would be low, it would be relatively easy to do. Although there are problems with that in that they don't measure, they can't account for non-GHG emissions, so it would need to be supplemented with something for them. Now, in saying that the stakes of the choice of allocation methods would not be particularly high with the background of a good, well-functioning cap and trade system, that doesn't mean that there couldn't still be complaints about the scheme, namely that there might be distributional effects which would be problematic. These are the sorts of worries that are raised about carbon pricing. So if you simply have a uniform carbon price that's, say, faced by consumers, it might turn out to be regressive in various ways, so that it might have disproportionate impacts on poor people and so on and so forth. So the issue is not whether or not, and similarly in the boating thing, you might think that suppose we said that what you needed to buy permits were the consumers who purchase fish which is caught by the boaters, right? They pay a premium for the fish they bought that pays for the extractor to run. Perhaps the people who are buying the fish are relatively poor, so we think that the fact that the incidence of tax even falls evenly on them, even if it's distributed in some way through the value chain, is problematic, right? But obviously, there are various ways you can try to address those sorts of problems. Okay, so we're not in that scenario. So we don't have a cap and trade scheme, and we don't have a well-functioning, well-designed carbon pricing scheme. Now, in this context, it seems that a fair bit hinges on this question. So people in this kind of context are accountable for their contributions to GHG contributions because they are increasing. And correspondingly, there is an increased risk of harm as a result of these contributions to these concentrations. Similarly, in the boating case, if there's no well-functioning scheme whereby people can only go boating pursuant to rules that ensure that as much toxin gets taken out of the lake as goes in, then each boater, certainly in the first instance, seems to be responsible for any risks they impose through their boating, right? If they aren't themselves ensuring that you extract as much toxin as they put in, then they are reasonably held accountable for the increased risk that they're imposing on the downstreamers who are put at risk by these increased toxic concentrations in the lake. Okay, so let's turn now to think about these different methods of allocating emissions in this second context, one where we don't have sort of a background scheme which is functioning to ensure that risk is kept at an acceptable level. Production-based emissions. Well, it's no wonder that these have pride of place in net zero accounting, typically, in that if anything should count as contributing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, it certainly seems that if you're actually burning the stuff and releasing it into the atmosphere, that should count as a relevant contribution to greenhouse gas concentration. So the question is whether or not this alone suffices as a good way of capturing whether an agent is contributing to the concentration of greenhouse gases. And it seems plausibly that it is not. So you could have an economy which reduced its production emissions by getting out of the business of creating widgets on its territory. But simultaneously, it might be importing just as much widgets from a neighboring country, and this neighboring country might actually be releasing more GHGs in its production than the country itself was. Right? So the idea would be this would seem to make it seem as if the country was making progress in terms of the organization of its economy in contributing to the global goal of becoming net zero, whereas in fact it was not. It was substituting imports for exports, and as a result, its actual net effect on the concentration of GHGs would be positive, even though its production emissions ledger would be reduced to zero. Right? Good. So again, and similarly, there might be other countries which seem sort of intuitively, again, to be contributing significantly to the concentration of greenhouse gases, but don't get picked up by, their contributions don't get picked up by this production-based accounting. So one can think of Australian mining operations, right? They're pulling the stuff out of the ground. It's not being burned there. It's being sold and burned somewhere else. But nevertheless, it seems strange that there's no allocation of any emission to Australia when it's pulling this stuff out of the ground, which is only of value to it. And its economy is partly based around the fact that this stuff can be sold to people who burn it and release it into the atmosphere. And this is not just sort of an academic worry, by the way, about the blind spots of production-based accounting. So there's been generally sort of a trend in European countries, for example, of fairly significant reductions in so-called production emissions, but increases in consumption-based emissions, in the sense that the amount of carbon embedded in the goods that are being imported and consumed here are increasing, even while the amount of carbon that's being released into the atmosphere here is reducing. And if we're interested in these net zero targets as measuring the extent to which the fundamental organization of a country's economy is such that it's making a significant contribution to the global goal of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions to zero, these seem to be problems. Right? So the general lesson, I think, of looking at the limitations of this kind of accounting is that there are other kinds of relatively direct economic relationships by which agents can contribute to greenhouse gas concentrations without directly producing them. And they should be held accountable for them, in the sense that if we're trying to measure their net contributions to concentrations, we should count these types of contributions as relevant to those attributions. Okay, so extraction-based and consumption-based accounting I won't talk about income-based accounting, but it may come up in the discussion, are problematic for much the same reason. If we focus simply on consumption-based accounting, it ignores emissions that a country produces. So a country could effectively be sharply reducing its consumption emissions, but increasing its production emissions, such that intuitively its net contribution would be positive, even though as measured by the consumption-based accounting, it would be sharply reducing. And extraction-based as well. So if you simply measured the degree to which simply measured emissions and allocated emissions at the point of extraction, it would ignore the countries which are actually engaging in burning this stuff into the atmosphere. So these two seem to be problematic in that they each have blind spots, various types of emissions that they seem to be linked to in the relevant way such that they can count as contributors to these emissions without being picked up by these methods. Good. Inducement-based accounting, which Ola has been developing, is an interesting alternative, and it, I think, has some clear advantages over the other methods surveyed. He links this idea of inducement to the idea of remedial responsibility, such that an agent sort of counts as sort of inducing emission. We want it to be connected to the idea that that agent should bear primary responsibility for addressing that emission. And plausibly, who counts as an inducer may depend on various circumstances. So in some cases, it may be an extractor. In some cases, it may be a producer. In some cases, it may be a consumer. So what's valuable in this approach, I think, is that it recognizes a plurality of ways in which the organization of a country's economy can be a contributing factor to the increase in global greenhouse gas concentrations. Good. Some difficulties, I think, or at least some challenges for this account is, one is that we often think that remedial responsibilities should be assigned to agents who are not inducers of emissions. So, for example, if I'm in a and this is a sort of an example that came up in discussion, it may be that if I sort of arrive on the scene of the boating case, and it would be costless for me to sort of push a button that would ensure that an extractor, a special extractor, would run forevermore at no cost. I should be responsible to do so. In fact, it may be that I'm primarily responsible for addressing sort of the toxins that are being released into the lake. But I certainly didn't induce the introduction of the toxins into the lake. And it also seems to me that there are various ways of inducing emissions in some relevant sense that are unrelated to a country's organization of its economy. But I think it's a sort of a difficult, or it's a strain to tie net zero accounting in such a way that emissions belong on these ledgers. So, for example, I think that if Sweden starts to produce more military equipment because of the war in Ukraine, and this is caused, of course, by Russia, who's engaged in this illegal invention, it does seem plausible to me that ultimate responsibility in some way for these emissions might lie with the Russians. But to say that that belongs on their emissions accounting seems a bit strained. So this seems to be a clear case where Sweden's emissions are increasing, but it has a good justification for increasing those emissions. And it may well be that we think that it could justifiably depart from a net zero target because it has a good positive justification for this increase in emissions. And a third is that it can be rather hard to pin down an idea of what it means to induce emissions that isn't rather heavily moralized and already sort of takes into account our ideas about who is most responsible in some case. Okay, so finally, I think so. A system of a net zero accounting should allow that some countries are not remedially responsible for some of their emissions, and that other countries can be remedially responsible for the emissions of others. So, in the case just described, Russia could be remedially responsible for the emissions of Sweden without it being Russia's emissions. Okay, so as I noted before, the choice of accounting method will make it more difficult or easier for different countries to achieve net zero. That seems to be a bit problematic. And each system seems to have certain blind spots. It doesn't take account not only of additions, and I've been focusing on the kinds of additions that don't get picked up, but also subtractions that might be relevant, right? So, for example, if a country is, say, a country, say, on an extraction-based accounting system, if the country that extracts is not in any way sort of paying attention to what happens downstream, it wouldn't account for various innovations that it might make that would reduce the amount of carbon that would be released into the atmosphere by its downstream customers. And this can lead to inefficiencies of various sorts. So if we imagine that a country's economy is structured so that it is a relevant contributor to emissions of various types, there may be cases in which it can make the most impactful and significant reductions by focusing on an area which is not captured by some particular method of accounting for allocating emissions. So, for example, if we're simply focusing on production emissions, it may be that the most significant progress that we could make at low cost in a wealthy country would actually by shifting consumption in various ways. But that wouldn't sort of count because it wouldn't sort of be coming into view if a country was focusing simply on reducing its production, right? So that's sort of inefficient. If we think that most countries have a limit to the cost that they're willing to bear for some particular purpose, such as becoming carbon neutral, then it may turn out that they can have better net effect on reducing their overall contribution to greenhouse gases by focusing on one area. And there's always the risk that that area won't be singled out by some particular accounting method that is present. Okay, so given this sort of background, it's useful to ask if we have to choose between one or another of these methods, which is preferable. And Joran has written some interesting papers discussing that issue. So there are reasons to believe that, for example, consumption-based accounting might offer some advantages over production-based accounting, in the sense that what the reasons to believe that might be that many of the relatively wealthy countries who have pledged relatively ambitious targets tend to have more consumption emissions than production emissions. So there might be some reason to believe that this would sort of shift the cost off the producing countries to the consuming countries in ways that might overall seem more efficient and more fair. So those are interesting questions. They're complicated questions. And it's not completely clear whether or not shifting a method of accounting from production to consumption would have the impact that people who advocate for consumption-based accounting think that it does. If we think that countries are, again, only willing to take on certain costs for certain purposes, and they have pledged to ambitious targets on production-based accounting, knowing that it's relatively easy for them to make those targets, then shifting to consumption-based target, which makes it more difficult to achieve that target, won't necessarily lead to correspondingly more ambitious plans to reduce emissions. It might actually cause them to push their target into the future or limit their ambition in various other ways. But the question I'm primarily focused on here is different, which is, can we construct accounting methods that inherit the strengths of these other methods without taking on their weaknesses? And the basic insight is that these different methods that we've been discussing do seem to be different ways in which an agent can acquire responsibility for contributing to increases in GHGs. Okay. That the different methods seem to be tracking different factors. And I'll just focus here on consumption, extraction, and production. Each of these seem to be a relevant way in which the fundamental organization of a country's economy can be a net contributor to greenhouse gases. So we need a system of accounting that makes sense of the plurality of the ways that the organization of an economy can make this kind of contribution. So unimaginatively, perhaps, this means allocating to a country not only emissions that it directly produces, but those that it resources, that is, that lie when it lies upstream in the value chain, and the future emissions of the same type that it enables and incentivizes when it lies downstream in the value chain. So the idea is that when countries are settling on an inventory of their emissions, they should be actually paying attention to these three different modes of contribution, all of which are mediated by the fundamental organization of its economy, and they should be tracking them independently of one another. So, for example, Australia sells its coal to China, where it's burned in a widget producing factory, and the widgets are sold in the United States. So the proposal is that we have separate ledgers on which these emissions appear on the ledgers of each of these countries. Okay. However, and again, this is where the framing in terms of risk imposition is relevant. If another agent in the chain is offsetting their own emissions, then those emissions don't make any risk imposition. So resourcing or incentivizing those emissions is not something for which you can be accountable. So the idea being that, an example being that, so suppose that China sells its coal Australia sells its coal to China, which produces widgets, which it sells to the United States. Now, suppose that the United States, contrary to any plausible, imaginable world, commits to offsetting all of the carbon that's sort of embedded in the consumption of widgets. Well, then, that would be a case where that would be stricken from the ledger of all three countries, because they would effectively have ensured that there was no net risk imposition from this system. Okay, so the picture then is this, so that you can be responsible for emissions that occur in various places in your value chain, but you can also take count on the debit side of your ledger various offsets that occur in the value chain. So the picture you start with in the first instance is a country would ask, well, at the first level, have our production emissions been offset? So did we purchase any offsets? And we would sort of, on the positive ledger, we would put all of our production emissions. And if we've purchased any offsets and matched them to any of these emissions productions, we would put them on the debit credit side of the ledger. Then, if we're able to find out by consulting the ledgers of our upstream providers or our downstream customers that they have been offsetting our emissions, we can count those too, right? So if I find out as a producer that that those consuming my goods have been offsetting those emissions, then I can strike that from my ledger as well. Or similarly, if my upstream providers have already offset then I can strike that from my ledger. So again, what we're looking at is whether or not I am part of a value chain that qua chain makes a net contribution to greenhouse gas concentrations or not. So then at the second level, we need to consider, again, the production emissions of those who lie upstream or downstream from us. So we look at their level 1 ledgers, where they're reporting any production emissions and offsets that they have, to see whether or not they have matching offsets to their production emissions. If they don't, we add them to our ledgers. If they do, then they don't have to go on our ledgers. So against these in the offsets column at this level, we can enter any removals that we make to offset the level 2 emissions. And if we find out that others are making removals to offset those emissions, we can legitimately add those as offsets. Right? So we in the first look at whether at our production emissions and whether they are being offset by others somewhere in the value chain. And then we look at the production emissions of others, for example, that we are selling resources to, and we look at whether or not they have offset their production emissions. If they're offsetting their production emissions, then that would come off our books as an extraction emission or a resource emission. So we would end up sort of something like this, again, where we are looking in the first at our own production emissions and then looking up, scanning our value chain to see whether or not they have been offset either by us or by others. And then second, looking at producers downstream or upstream from us and look about whether or not they have been offsetting their emissions. So again, Australia sells its coal to China, where it's burned in a widget making factory. The widgets are all bought in Sweden, which more plausibly pays for carbon removal from the amount of the carbon embedded in the production of widgets. So in this sort of case, effectively, neither China nor Australia would have any emissions as a result sort of on their ledger because they've effectively been offset by Sweden. So in this case, Chinese production emissions that Australia resources have been offset by Sweden. Now, the Australians can say that they're running a net zero emissions operation since all the coal they're digging up and putting into the atmosphere is counterbalanced by the Swedish removals. And again, think about the boating analogy. If, for example, we know that the consumers of fish that we get on the lake are committed to running a toxin extractor that matches the amount of toxins that our boats put in, then when we go boating, we can say we're running a zero toxin operation, right? Because we're not actually adding through our boating to the concentration of toxins in the lake, given that there's this other actor downstream which is paying for these removals. Of course, in the toy example, Australia can only say this if all the coal they extract is emitted, that is extracted and used in producing widgets is actually offset in this way. But wait, does this seem strange? Does this mean that China could get to count as making a net zero contribution to anthropogenic global warming if they are in fact the world's biggest producer of emissions, but their emissions are offset by their suppliers and their customers? And the answer is yes, they could. This is the correct result. If there was a commitment of those resourcing them or those consuming to offset all the emissions they produce, they could say that they're running a net zero operation, because it's true that their economy is structured in such a way that, given the background conditions in which they're functioning, they make no net contribution to global warming. Of course, China could still be blameworthy, and we might say that there's something unfair about this, because especially if they were sort of indifferent to how the costs of ensuring that all of their production emissions offset is distributed. But we think that's okay, that a system of emissions accounting is not a complete theory of climate ethics. There's first the question of what are the ways in which a country can be relevantly related to an emission such that it makes sense to put it on its ledger. And there's the second question of what is a fair system of allocation of cost for ensuring that different emissions are offset, right? So this might be a case where the Swedes would have complaints against the Chinese or the Australians, insofar as they alone are bearing the cost of ensuring that this net zero economy continues. But it's a separate question about who is actually, which emissions belong on which ledgers. All three of these actors are, in the first instance, involved by the structure of their economies in the generation of a certain amount of carbon, and they bear relevant relations to that carbon that, in the first instance, it goes on the positive side of their ledgers. Now, as it happens, they have enough on the negative side of their ledgers, given the activity of somebody in the value chain, to offset them. So what would be some of the benefits of such a scheme? Well, the proposal, it would incentivize emissions removals by making emissions removers into attractive buyers and sellers. So if you were sort of known to be a emissions remover, or somebody who was sort of committed to being to offsetting your consumption emissions, at least partly, that would then increase the incentive to do business with you insofar as you're committed to making a net zero pledge, because when I'm selling stuff to you through my production and you're a consumption offsetter, then that means that that comes off my production's emissions tab because those emissions are being offset by you. It would also, of course, create sort of incentives for countries which were net zero aligned to collaborate with one another and to think about different ways of doing sort of cost sharing. And it might be that their interactions would start to mimic something like a cap and trade scheme, where even if some countries were sort of known to place, for example, to offset their production emissions, this would then be sort of reflected in the prices that they sell to consumers, right? So that the value chain starts to distribute some of the cost of the initial incidence of cost falling on one actor in this chain. The other thing is that it removes some of the inefficiencies of the sort of single variable accounting, in that, again, it may be that different countries find it more effective at the same cost to make interventions to reduce emissions in one or another part of their value chain. Right? Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'll just end by raising a few sort of issues and some initial thoughts about them, but there's a lot more to think through. So one question is sort of feasibility concerns. Is such a system feasible? And are there incentives to bring it about? And if it could be brought about, could it be sustained? Two things. Well, first is that in the first instance, we're sort of thinking about what a fair allocation system would sort of look like. There's a separate question about whether it's feasible. But we think that there might be reason to think that there could be incentives to bring it about, for much the same reason that people have incentives to become net zero in the first place. If you could promote a system of more complete accounting as sort of a more ambitious commitment to being a good climate actor, the club of net zero plus countries, say, some of the reputational benefits and would sort of follow would be the same kinds of reputational benefits that I take it agents are seeking in trying to make these pledges. And of course, it would also have certain benefits in that, countries can now be rightly criticized if they're simply ignoring various ways in which they are making significant contributions to the increase of global greenhouse gases, while simultaneously acting as if they are being good climate actors by reducing their production emissions. So there would be certain benefits there as well. The other thing, of course, about feasibility is how we're sort of imagining this. Of course, if you were to say, could we now change the UN framework so that it allowed this sort of multiple contribution type reporting? Maybe not. Maybe that wouldn't be feasible. But you don't necessarily need to think of something like this as a single undertaking to be opted into by all countries. You might think about it as a single undertaking whereby you would try to develop sort of a club of countries that commits to sort of this more ambitious type of target, which doesn't inherit the blind spots of alternative methods and can more credibly be presented as a good metric for determining whether or not your country is contributing to the global goal of reducing greenhouse gas concentrations. Another concern is such a scheme informationally demanding? As I mentioned before, it's rather easy. It's rather more easy, and again, I'm just relying on expert testimony. I don't know any of this firsthand. To come up with metrics for judging how much carbon is being released into the atmosphere, or extracted, or the amount of the amount of emissions that will likely follow from a certain amount of coal that's being pulled out of the earth, then measuring things like consumption emissions. So this scheme might look like it would be quite informationally demanding, and also, of course, is informationally demanding in the sense that you have to be able to sort of look fairly far downstream to sort of come up with the total effects of your, say, selling coal to somebody, right? You have to look at what it's going to be used on, what those products are going to be, what sort of effects they're going to have. So I think these are actually genuine issues. But again, one of the nice things about it is that it sort of encourages us to start to look for information where it's available. And there are various different ways in which you can make a little bit more tractable. One is by focusing only on those areas where you feel that there's very significant impact. So for example, one area which is easier to measure if you're a producer is, for example, the amount of carbon that's embedded in electricity that you're buying. So that is for many companies a very significant part of the way in which they are sort of in this value chain and contributing. In other cases, it may not be. It may be stuff like end use, or you can find out that, as some firms have, for example, that a lot of the sort of downstream ways in which they are affecting the emissions is through employee travel to work, right? And they can do surveys and they start to collect this information. So there might be ways in which you don't in any way sort of make a claim to completeness in your accounting all of these sort of downstream emissions or upstream, but you focus on specific areas which seem to be rather significant areas and try to benchmark against those and try to think about what your reductions are going to be against those. And finally, inclusion criterion. So I've been speaking loosely about contributing to increases, and I've been saying, and I've been focusing on particular ways in which countries can contribute to increases. And I made a broad distinction between ways of contributing to greenhouse gas concentration that seem to be fundamentally related to the organization of the economy and other types, right? But it may be very difficult to make that super precise. So it certainly seems that we think there might be sort of a difference between a case in which a country is contributing to increase greenhouse gas because it's foiling climate negotiations, and when it's actually increasing the emissions it's putting into the atmosphere. Both of those are ways in which you can become causally responsible for increasing gas emissions. But one seems the sort of thing that belongs on a net zero ledger and the other does not. But again, there may be rather difficult cases where it's harder to tell just what looks like an appropriate criteria for inclusion. Okay, well, that's it for me. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, so now we're moving into the Q&A section, and before we start, I'm supposed to say a few things. This whole event is recorded, and that holds also for the first half hour of the Q&A. So if you wish to ask a question, if you're online, then you should write that in the chat, and also mention which discipline you're from. Okay, I think that's it. So I will alternate between the online people and the people in this room, and I will start with a room person, Joe.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was super interesting, and I think I have a sense of how it kind of works as an accounting system. But I want to ask you a little bit about like which of the things that I think of as the two goals that accounting systems can accomplish it's going for. Because I wonder whether you're sort of dodging the fairness question in a sense. Like it's true that it accomplishes an accounting which says where all of the emissions are, but it's not obvious that it answers the question who should do something about it. So in your three-part value chain, you've got Australia, China, Sweden, let's say the US, Australia, China, the US. So now they all have to achieve net zero, but it seems they can still have the debate about who should do it. And if they all stand there pointing at each other, then we have a bit of a deadlock. And the thing about single variable accounting is that they just fiat what the answer to that is. They just say it's the consumer, it's the producer, and so on. So there's a kind of sense in which yours is more complete, and it also, if they're all good actors, it kind of allocates the responsibility to each of them. But if they disagree, it doesn't resolve that. So maybe you're just not trying to do that.
Yeah.
But that was what I wondered about.
Yeah, so I do think it's sort of important to sort of separate these questions of overall fairness to the sort of accounting system. Again, just also because I think that there can be cases where the fairest thing is that nobody in the value chain actually is responsible for the corresponding offset. So, example I think Euron gave at one point was, if a Martian arrives and they can just, costlessly suck all of this stuff out of the atmosphere, then fairness dictates that they should do it. It costs them nothing, and it costs everybody, even the wealthy countries, significant amount to do it. So we could say that it's unfair if they don't do it, but nevertheless, it seems strange to say that those emissions belong on their ledger. Right? So I do think that there is reason to sort of separate these questions, and I think that there is a way in which some fairness issues do get drawn to the fore by having this system. So these are the fairness questions about how, if you locate them in simply one part of the chain, it sort of is overlooking sort of other parts of the chain. So I think that you're right. So with good actors, obviously that they would sort of have incentives to sort of collaborate in various ways and to come up with sort of cost-sharing mechanisms for greening their supply chains. Now, of course, there might be other actors, of course, who don't, right? And you might say that they wouldn't have any interest in doing that whatsoever. And I think that's just true. I don't think there's all that much you could do about it. But it would create disincentives for people to interact economically with actors who are making no such commitments. And arguably, that's something that we should want. We should want there to be increasing connections and incentives to develop a club of countries which do have these commitments while isolating those that don't. There's still the question of, well, what could you do about those that don't? And isn't it unfair to the countries that do? And then again, there are other things you could do. You could do stuff like putting tariffs on countries' exports who are not sort of committed, so that at the very least you're starting to engage in sort of cost sharing with them, even if they don't express sort of commitment to these goals.
Okay, Gustav.
Thank you very much for this talk. I want to go back to some basic, because I'm interested. You probably thought it's true, but I mean, you want to hold, to a certain extent, producers, suppliers accountable. And I wonder how that compares to other parts of morality if you make the same move or step. So as they say in your origin, guns don't kill, people do. And I guess coal doesn't kill the atmosphere, people burning it do. And you wonder if willing to say that the Australian coal miners should be held accountable, should weapon producers also be held accountable for murders and war? And if not, I want to know the difference. But you could also bite that bullet. But then I would go on and also ask about other parts, like when it comes to prostitution, should it's not just the buyers that are the problem, but also the suppliers. And again, so I wonder about the kind of deeper notion here. And I wonder also, I mean, you criticize Olle for being too moralized, but I didn't understand how this kind of idea of holding producers accountable is also moralized to a certain extent. So I wonder why this criticism of Olle was valid, why it's not valid for you. That's the question.
Thanks. Garrett, did you want to come in on this or the previous question? Then I'll,
Yeah, so I'll make a comment if I may. Hi, Gustav.
Hi,
so,
love to see you.
The way we're thinking about it is that there can be double counting of responsibility. So to take your gun supplier example, if I know that a gun is going to be used to threaten someone, and I go ahead and sell them a gun, knowing that that's going to happen, then there is moral accountability, I think. And what we say is that the aggressor is 100% responsible for the aggressive act, and I bear some responsibility as well. And then so the thought is that in a context in which we know that the fossil fuels are going to be burned, they'll go up into the atmosphere, there's harm being done by that, then those who supply the materials, knowing that that's what's going to happen to them, do bear some accountability. Now, this leads to the second part of your question. Are we then trying to construct some sort of accounting system that keeps a kind of moral score sheet on every economic agent? And the thought is that there's accountability for risk imposition. And then whether you can actually justify the imposition of that risk is a separate question. But what a net zero ledger might aspire to do is to say, if you're presenting yourself as a good global citizen, what are the contributions towards rising atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations that you can be asked to account for? And then if you've got no capacity to sustain yourself economically without doing this, that might be some sort of justification. So it falls short of an overall judgment about whether you're doing something morally impermissible or not, but there's at least tracks something for which you might be morally accountable.
Okay, thank you. That was a very good answer. But doesn't that diminish or kind of blunts the criticism of Olle Torpmans? I mean, you criticize that for being too moralized. But I mean, there is some moralization going on here too, as you acknowledge.
So I suppose the way we're reading Olle is making an overall judgment of remedial responsibility. and seeking to have an accounting system that tracks that. Whereas our thought is there are risk imposers, and that then that there's a potentially a way of measuring the risk imposition for which you're accountable, and then whether you can account for that is a separate question that bears on some judgment of overall remedial responsibility or wrongdoing.
No, so that's good. So that opened up the avenue for a rather interesting change of other parts of morality too.
Yeah,
such as weapons production, prostitution, and things like that.
Right. So it's definitely intended as an ethically informed contribution to thinking about under what circumstances can a net zero accounting system be adopted by a climate actor and them say, we're being responsible global citizens. We're actually contributing towards achieving a net zero economy, partly through presenting oneself as a morally responsible agent.
Thanks.
Christian, did you want to add?
No, that's fine.
Gustav, you're happy?
I'm happy. I'm looking forward to this revolution.
Okay, so then we have Mats.
So thank you very much, Christian. This is a clarificatory question, or perhaps this is digging more into the details than you want at the moment. But so it struck me when you said that offsetting related to a particular extraction or a particular production should kind of be subtracted, if I understood you correctly. But what about offsettings that aren't in any way really connected to a particular production or a particular consumption or a particular extraction? So a country could go about offsetting because it's a good thing to do, right? And it could be really difficult to tie that in any way to any production.
Good. Yeah, good question. So let me take it. So I imagine that a country accounting might operate in a number of different ways. So one is that they might engage in matching. So they say the Swedes have an offsetting program, and they might say, okay, we have purchased some electricity from, I don't know who they purchased electricity from. We've purchased some gas from somebody, and we're going to, and this offset is matching against that. Okay, so that would be sort of an ideal situation where you would sort of be effectively tagging, and then the gas provider could match that offset against them. But it may not be that they engage in tagging, and so but you might nevertheless say, I sell a certain carbon equivalent of goods to the Swedes. And then what I would look at is to what extent are they offsetting overall their sort of consumption emissions, so that if I can't engage in any sort of tagging, I can come up with the general picture of what is sort of the ratio of embedded carbon that they're offsetting. And then this is just something I thought about just the other day. And then I would be able to sort of claim that ratio of offsets against my, right? So the idea that if it's matched, you can appeal it. And again, maybe they're matching in some areas and not here. If they match in other areas, but they also have certain generic offsets, then I would exclude from the ratio all the offsets that they're already sort of matching with other particular sort of products, right? So that would be my sort of first attempt at an answer. So because it captures the idea that, well, in the absence of any explicit tagging, we can sort of make some broad assumptions about what proportion of the carbon embedded in the products they're offsetting, and that I can correspondingly reduce the amount that is on my ledger by the amount that they are offsetting generally. Again, excluding any particular matching things that I can't have to exclude from consideration. Right.
Okay, Kian?
Thanks, Christian. It's a very ambitious proposal, very interesting proposal, and I'm worried about how it's going to play out in terms of the units of account. So my concern is that extractor versus producer versus consumer doesn't carve nature of its joints. That's a sort of short version of my problem. And the reason is that producers come at all different levels of the value chain. So there's no sort of privileged level at who is the producer. So just to give you an example, so some company gets some raw materials, some steel, and makes rivets or screws or something like this. They can sell those to the consumer, and they would be the relevant producer in many intuitive senses. But of course, some of those screws get sold to, say, hubcap makers or wheel makers or something, and so they produce wheels. In this situation, you would double count. You would get multiple producers that would be responsible for those allocated the emissions associated with those screws. And of course, that would happen again if those wheels were put into a car and that car was sold to a consumer. So I think that what you're thinking is that there's some privileged producer, and I don't think that that's the case. And so I don't think you're just going to get some double counting. You're going to get massive double counting throughout the value chain. And it's going to be either difficult to identify privileged producers, or you're going to get arbitrarily massive multiplication of producers. So extraction, that's the reason why extraction and consumption are somewhat easier to adapt to, because they're going to be much more determinate who is actually an extractor, because it happens once, or who is a consumer. If you think it's an end user consumer, that's going to happen once. But if you're talking about producers, they happen all throughout the chain, and it gets very complicated very quickly.
Garrett, did you want to speak to this, or should... I'm happy to take it otherwise.
Sorry, I'm just fiddling with my mute button there.
Okay.
The thought is that this is basically scope 3 net zero emissions accounting, plus allowing for offsetting, if there is such a thing as bona fide real offsetting. And the idea of making sense of this in terms of two levels is that if there are countries or companies that are purporting to be net zero just in terms of the emissions they directly produce, there needs to be some kind of accounting system for that. And then any entity, any climate actor that purports to be scope 3 net zero would then need to look at the level 1 emissions record of those that they do business with. And I mean, you're right that then adds a level of complexity. But there are, I suppose, some corporate agents who are talking about aspiring to being scope 3 net zero. And they would need to be engaging in some exercise of this sort by way of primarily, at least in the first instance, looking at their own direct emissions, and then investigating the record of those that they do business with, either as consumers of components from others or suppliers to others. And I suppose that's the idea behind accountability for scope 3 emissions.
And the idea also wasn't that there would be any particular discrete moment at which production emissions alone are sort of counted. So if I'm a producer and I'm producing stuff that then later on is also used in production by others, then I need to pay attention to those production emissions of those downstream from me, as well as my own production emissions. Yeah, so by saying production emissions, the idea is not that with respect to any particular end good that gets consumed by somebody, that there has to have been one particular point at which there's production. There might be all sorts of components that are produced in different places that go into a particular good. The thought is merely that I need to pay attention to all of those emissions if I'm an end user, and I need to be concerned with all of those emissions, including production emissions that are downstream from my production emissions.
Okay, so I guess what I'm getting from those responses is that when we're thinking about the target of this, so the idea of firms including their scope 3 emissions, which some firms have tried to do, they're not concerned about double counting, and it sounds like the implication is that you're basically not concerned about double counting, because what's going to end up happening is that they're going to end up including the emissions of other firms and so forth in the process. So I guess the way I was thinking that your proposal is working is it's supposed to be large scale and it's supposed to be an accounting exercise and the standard accounting exercise of avoiding double counting. But it seems like it's not going to do that.
Yeah, that's spot on. So that's part of the reason for distinguishing between a system in which a situation in which we've got an effective form of global regulation, where we want to make sure that we're proportioning out the costs of reaching net zero so that we reach 100%. But if we're operating in a context in which we haven't reached that yet, and there is then a question about whether you're behaving in an ethically responsible way towards the people who are going to be on the receiving end of a worsening climate, then double counting, we think, is actually required in order to take account of the point that Gustav was gesturing towards earlier on. Where there's risk imposition, there may be several agents that are responsible for it.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, so double counting would be problematic at that sort of the top level if you were getting an inaccurate account of how much overall is being released into the atmosphere, for example. And it would also be a problem if people were double counting offsets, but our system doesn't allow for that.
Olle.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. A lot to discuss there. First of all, a clarification. I don't think that my account, or it's not supposed to be an overall account of remedial responsibility, but it's not your fault. It's the manuscript that's not too clear about it. But on that note, I think that the purpose of these accounts is to capture the one responsible making feature of agents in virtue of which they are remedially responsible for emissions. But there are other such features as well, as for instance ability, which is captured by the Martian example, or this example in the boating case where a person could, without any cost to him or herself, push a button that would extract all the... and then related to this on some of the objections to these other emissions accounting methods. I agree with you that the one problem with the production-based emissions accounting method is that a country could, or an agent could, become carbon neutral simply by offshoring all of their production. But then you mentioned that a similar objection applies as well to the consumption based accounting. You said that it's possible to simply reduce consumption completely, and I was just curious about how that's...
Oh yeah, I wasn't imagining, I'll speak to the second one. So I wasn't imagining that you could reduce consumption to zero, but you could offset your consumption emissions.
Okay.
Right, so you could come to be claiming to be, you might reduce your consumption and you might offset your remaining consumption while simultaneously producing. So that was the parallel.
Yeah.
Not that you could reduce your consumption to zero. You could potentially reduce your consumption-based emissions to zero.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think in a way, we think that what you're calling like a responsible making feature. So we do think that can it be said of you that the organization of your economy is a relevant contributor to increased greenhouse gas concentration? That is a responsible making feature. It's not sort of an all things considered judgment, but it is a responsible making feature. So that's what we're trying to capture. So I suppose, so I guess the question is whether our picture of these sort of different modes of contribution and different modes of contribution which are left out gives a better picture than sort of the inducement model. So the inducement, I mean, I know it's in a way unfair because you're still working. We're both kind of, we're both kind of working out our ideas here. But I think we're after a similar thing. What can you focus on to say what are sort of a relevant connection to an emission such that they can be accountable, whether or not there are others that are accountable and whether or not they have justification is a separate issue. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Göran.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thanks a lot. That was super interesting. I think I have two brief comments or remarks about the feasibility component of the idea. So one thing you might want to say, because I was thinking to myself as you were presenting, so what ultimately are we going to do in terms of constructing these national emissions inventories? And one thing you could say is actually in your account, you still treat, it seems to me, production-based accounting or maybe territory-based accounting as the primary way of counting emissions. But what you allow for is offsetting, and you allow for sort of indirect offsetting by other actors. So my thought, one thing you could say is if the idea is that ultimately we're going to begin with Australia's production-based emissions, but then it might turn out that they are being saved by consumers offsetting their emissions later on. Then you have a geography-based system of accounting which allows for offsetting. And now if you say that, then you can say, actually, this is not such an alien idea at all, because if you remember the Kyoto Protocol allowed for the clean development mechanism, joint implementation. So these are kind of old ideas within the confines of treating geography as the sort of first step of accounting. So that's one thing. The second thing is similar to Joe's, but I wouldn't put the objection in terms of fairness. It seems to me like when you allow any of these actors to offset to the benefit of all actors, all other actors in the value chain, then you seem to be introducing a pretty severe collective action problem into the situation here. And I don't think that you're entitled to keep that problem undiscussed, because you mentioned yourself that there might be positive incentive effects of your proposal. So incentivizes, you're the sort of person that people like doing business with because you're generous in terms of offsetting emissions. So you need, I think, to have a solid response to this idea that this is a bad collective action problem, because now you have three sets of actors who can point to each other saying, no, you should offset these emissions. I shouldn't do that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to, by fiat, take the first part of the question and leave the second to Garrett. So the first, I think, one that was really interesting. I think you're right, but maybe not completely right about what we envisioned. So you're right in that we think that production-based accounting has an important role to play here, and also that we take seriously the idea of offsets down the value chain. But I guess we're not necessarily giving it a privileged place in the sense that we're sort of neglecting other modes of contribution to emissions other than production. So I guess that would be a significant addition, in addition to the allowing to sort of count offsets down the value chain, is that we would also take seriously emissions down the value chain and also upstream emissions.
So I mean, I think sorry for interrupting. I think maybe there's something about the term level one. Level one seems like
I guess it was more thinking of it as sort of an initial starting point, partly against the baseline of how people engage in reporting now, but it's not that you would necessarily need to privilege that. I mean, if it turned out that it made sense to think about level one in terms of extraction, I don't think there would be any problem for a model in thinking about it there.
Yeah. So shall I say something about Jeroen's collective action problems? So the way we're thinking about this is as follows. Would there be any incentive for any agent to present themselves as scope 3 net zero? And the answer seems to be, at least under some circumstances, yes. That there are reputational benefits for corporations and potentially democratic pressures on at least democratic governments to do something better than being net zero based on purely production-based methods of accounting and then outsource all the production to somewhere else. And then the question becomes, would the idea that at some point in this value chain, there could be offsetting that everyone who's committed to being scope 3 net zero could then claim credit for, would that kind of cause this kind of aspiration to collapse? Because as you put it, you'd have people at different points of the value chain who would all be looking at each other saying, well, why don't you do the offsetting? And there, the thought, I suppose, is that if it's possible to be incentivized to present yourself as scope 3 net zero, then at least if you're interacting with other agents who have a similar commitment, it's actually potentially a commercial advantage to be able to say, okay, well, you can be scope 3 net zero. And we think that this would be a legitimate claim by doing business with us, because you're digging up the coal, we're burning it and offsetting the emissions, and so you're running an emissions-free fossil fuel extraction operation.
Okay, we have some more questions and also a finger, but I'm afraid we have to stop now and thank Christian and also Garrett for this interesting discussion.
Thank you very much.
I'll also say that the next upcoming seminar is on October 26th, and where Victoria Spacer and Nicole Nisbet is going to talk about climate crisis norm entrepreneurs. How successful are they? Okay, thank you.